My parents threw me out. I was 17 when it happened. My mom looked at me with this smug grin and said, "You'll come crawling back in a month." My dad didn't say a word, he just slammed the door in my face. I was furious. I didn't turn around, not once. 9 years passed, and suddenly my phone wouldn't stop ringing. It was them, desperate for me to answer. Honestly, I never thought I'd be sharing any of this online. But after seeing a few similar stories posted here, I figured writing everything out might help me clear my head. And who knows, maybe someone else dealing with messed up family drama might find it useful or relatable. I really don't know. So here it goes. My name's Dylan, I'm 27 now, but the story really kicks off when I was just 17. It was my junior year in high school, and I'd always fallen short of being the son my parents wanted. My dad worked at the local factory, and my mom was a receptionist. We weren't wealthy, but we did all right in our little town. They had my entire future mapped out: good grades, state university, just like dad, marry a nice local girl, have a couple kids. In other words, their picture-perfect American dream. The only problem? School was torture for me. Not because I was stupid, I actually got decent grades when I managed to focus, but because of my ADHD, which we didn't even discover until later. Sitting through long, dull classes on subjects I didn't care about felt unbearable. What I really enjoyed was working with my hands, building things, fixing stuff. At 15, I spent an entire summer helping our neighbor Eli remodel his garage, and it was the first time I ever felt genuinely good at something. But my parents couldn't stand it. Every time I mentioned getting into construction or learning a trade, my mom's face would twist up like I'd just announced plans to dumpster dive professionally. My dad would go on about wasted potential and how our kind don't do manual labor. Looking back, it seems they were just obsessed with appearances, wanting to boast about their son, the college grad, not the guy wearing a tool belt. Things had been tense for a long time. I'd picked up a part-time job at the local store after school, quietly saving money because something deep inside me sensed I'd eventually need it. My grades started sliding because honestly, I just couldn't bring myself to care anymore. Every family dinner turned into another fight about college, my future, and how I was supposedly ruining my life. The final breaking point came in April, about a month and a half before graduation. I'd been accepted into state, thanks mostly to my parents who had practically filled out my application themselves. But I had also secretly applied to a trade school program. It was cheaper, shorter, and it offered a partial scholarship based on a portfolio of projects I'd put together myself. I decided to break the news over dinner. Big mistake. The moment I mentioned trade school, my dad slammed his fork down so hard it bounced off the plate. My mom burst into tears, acting as though I'd announced I was dying or something equally horrific. What followed was the worst fight we'd ever had. My dad accused me of being ungrateful and throwing their sacrifices away. My mom sobbed about how disappointed she was, questioning where they went wrong raising me. I tried explaining my excitement about trade school, but my dad cut me off and said something I'll never forget: "No son of mine is going to waste his life that way. If you're too stupid to appreciate the opportunity you're throwing away, maybe you're not the son we thought you were." That's when I snapped. I told them I was tired of living my life just to fulfill their dreams, that I was almost an adult and had the right to choose my own path. I shouted that they never once cared to listen to what I wanted. It got nasty. Really nasty. I said some things I regret, they said worse. Eventually, my dad gave me an ultimatum: if I wasn't going to follow their rules, I had to get out. I'm pretty sure he expected me to cave. But I didn't. I went upstairs, grabbed the emergency bag I'd packed weeks earlier, my gut was right all along, stuffed in some extra clothes, grabbed my laptop, the $1,300 in cash I'd saved, and my essential documents: birth certificate, social security card, everything. Thank God for my paranoia. When I came back down with my bag, my parents looked genuinely shocked, like they couldn't believe I was actually leaving. My mom started in again with the "you're making a huge mistake" speech, saying I thought I knew everything at 17. My dad stood silently by the door, arms crossed. As I stepped outside, my mom yelled after me, "You'll come crawling back in a month. You have no idea how tough the real world is." The smirk on her face broke something inside me. My dad didn't even glance at me, He slammed the door shut the moment I stepped out. I stood on our front lawn, numb, as it started to rain, a perfectly dramatic moment straight out of some Hollywood film. Then, I called Spencer, my friend whose parents were actually decent people. Those first few days were a total blur. Spencer's parents let me crash on their couch, but I knew that couldn't last forever. I was still in school, trying to graduate while also figuring out basic survival, like where I was going to live or how I was going to feed myself. Overnight, I was forced to learn how to be an adult. I couldn't concentrate. I kept having these awful moments where the reality would suddenly hit. Holy shit, I'm homeless. I'd sneak off to the bathroom at school and have panic attacks. But one thing kept pushing me forward, pure, stubborn anger. There was no way in hell I was going to give my parents the satisfaction of crawling back. Spencer's mom helped me apply for emergency assistance since technically I was now considered an unaccompanied minor. The school guidance counselor, one of the few adults who'd ever listened to me, guided me through the process of legal emancipation. I picked up extra shifts at my job and got a second gig washing dishes at a diner. The hardest part wasn't the logistics, it was the emotional stuff. Watching other kids with their normal, loving families, hearing classmates complain about minor arguments with parents who still cared deeply about them, made me realize how messed up my situation really was. Normal parents don't kick their kids out just because they want to choose a trade over college. It took some time to realize that the way my parents made love feel conditional wasn't normal. About 3 weeks after I left, my mom texted me, not to apologize or check on me, but just to say, when you're ready to apologize and accept our terms, you can come home. I didn't bother replying. A week after that, my dad left me a voicemail basically repeating the same thing. They were convinced I'd fail and were just counting down the days until I came begging, ready to rub it in my face. I graduated high school while still crashing on Spencer's couch. My parents showed up at graduation, probably just to maintain appearances. They tried to approach me afterward, but I walked right past them without a word. There wasn't anything left to say. By June, I'd saved enough money to move into a rundown apartment with 2 other guys. It was a total dump, but at least part of it was mine. I enrolled in the trade program, using my scholarship and working nearly full-time to cover the rest. It was brutal, but whenever exhaustion made me think about quitting, I'd remember my mom's smirk and my dad slamming that door, and I'd push through it. That first year on my own was honestly the hardest thing I've ever done. I was lonely, scared, and permanently tired. Some nights I cried myself to sleep because, even as messed up as they were, I missed having a family. There were mornings when getting out of bed felt impossible. But I still did it, every single day. And guess what? I never went crawling back. Not in a month, not ever. Things eventually started improving, but it was a long, rough road. I honestly didn't expect my original post to blow up like it did. Thanks to everyone who showed support. Here's the next part of my story. Those initial months alone were basically a nightmare. After those weeks at Spencer's, I ended up in an absolute dump of an apartment. One roommate, Jordan, worked nights, so I barely ever saw him, and Austin, the other roommate, was probably dealing something shady, but he paid rent and kept to himself. Roaches would practically wave at me when I flicked the kitchen lights on. The shower had this habit of turning ice cold at the worst possible moments, like when shampoo was running into my eyes. The walls were paper thin. I knew way too much about the neighbor's relationship drama. But it was mine, or at least 1/3 mine. As long as I paid rent, no one could throw me out again. I juggled 2 miserable jobs, working at a hardware store in the evenings and washing dishes at a diner on weekends. Between that and attending trade school, I was lucky if I slept 4 hours a night. My diet was ramen, eggs, and leftover fries from work. I lost like 20 pounds and probably looked half dead most days. Scrolling through Instagram and seeing other kids my age at parties, enjoying family vacations, or just living normal lives felt surreal. Meanwhile, I was stressing about whether I could stretch laundry for another week because I needed those quarters for bus fare. My parents did reach out a few times, always the same story. When would I stop being stubborn and come home? They never bothered asking if I was actually okay. You'd think they'd at least check if I had food or something. Nope. Just more guilt trips about admitting defeat. One afternoon, about 3 months in, my dad showed up at the hardware store. I was stocking shelves when my coworker told me, "There's some guy in khakis asking for you." I peeked out and saw my dad standing awkwardly in the paint aisle, completely out of place. I hid in the stockroom until he finally gave up and left, watching him stand in the parking lot through the window for 15 minutes before he drove away. He never tried again after that. About 4 months into living on my own, things began shifting. A regular customer named Raphael, who often came to the hardware store for renovation supplies, asked me for help finding parts for a sink. I ended up not only finding what he needed but drawing a detailed installation diagram. It turned out he did renovations, mostly kitchens and bathrooms, and recognized that I knew what I was talking about. He offered me work on some of his projects, paying way better than the store, and it actually aligned with my trade school skills. It felt like my first real break. Unlike my dad, Raphael respected people who worked with their hands. He took pride in his craft, patiently teaching me the right way to do things. For the first time, someone recognized my potential for who I was, not what they wanted me to become. Around 6 months in, my parents tried a new tactic. My mom started texting that she missed me, while my dad offered to compromise on my education if I just moved back home. But that just made me angry again. Now they were acting like letting me have some choices was generous. Hard pass. I wrapped up my first year of trade school with solid grades. Turns out, I wasn't dumb, I just needed to be learning something I cared about. Raphael gave me more responsibility, and I moved out of the Roach Motel into a slightly better apartment, this time sharing with just one roommate, a nursing student named Caleb who was as broke as I was but thankfully believed in regular showers. By 19, I'd earned my first certification and was earning decent money, not the glamorous kind, but enough to afford groceries, pay bills on time, and even save a little. Raphael started recommending me for side jobs, and gradually, things were finally looking up. Small repairs, installations, that kind of thing. Gradually, I started building a solid reputation and growing my client base. One unexpected side effect of working in people's homes was seeing firsthand how different families actually interacted with each other. I'd be in the middle of installing a light fixture and overhear parents encouraging their kids, genuinely praising them for getting B's on tests, or hugging them without needing any particular reason. I'd notice the family photos hung proudly on the walls, pictures from vacations, graduations, goofy candid shots, ordinary families that occasionally argued but clearly loved each other unconditionally. Witnessing this regularly was eye-opening. It made me realize just how messed up my own family's dynamic had been. Right around the time I turned 20, my mom unexpectedly showed up at my apartment. I honestly had no clue how she'd tracked down my address, probably through some mutual connection on Facebook or something similar. Standing there at my doorway, she looked noticeably older, worn down somehow. I almost didn't recognize her at first glance. Awkwardly, I invited her inside, because, realistically, what else could I do? She walked through my apartment, looking around with an expression on her face that wasn't quite disgust, but definitely one of subtle disapproval. I could practically see her mentally listing all the ways my current life was beneath the grand plan she'd envisioned for me. She asked surface-level questions about my job and my day-to-day life before eventually revealing the true reason behind her visit. Apparently, my dad had recently missed out on a promotion, and now they were facing some financial struggles. She wanted to know if I could help them out financially. The audacity of that request genuinely made me laugh. Just 2 years earlier, they'd thrown me out, convinced I'd fail miserably on my own, and now here they were, asking for my help. I told her bluntly that I was still trying to establish myself and couldn't spare anything at the moment. She left visibly annoyed, like I'd failed some imaginary test. She didn't even bother to pretend she was proud of me for successfully navigating life on my own. After her visit, I went through a strange emotional period. I started questioning everything, wondering if perhaps I was wrong for keeping them at arm's length, if I was being too harsh. But then memories of how they'd treated me, how they'd never genuinely apologized, would flood back, reigniting my anger all over again. My roommate, Caleb, noticed I was struggling and introduced me to his friend Natalie, who was studying psychology. Natalie quickly became one of my closest friends and helped me realize I'd experienced a form of emotional abuse. She explained that the way my parents had conditioned their love based on me following their exact plans wasn't normal or healthy. Talking to Natalie helped me process some of that anger and slowly begin healing. By the time I was 21, my situation had improved enough to get my own place, a modest, one-bedroom apartment, nothing fancy but completely mine. No roommates, no parents, just me. The day I moved in, I sat down on my second-hand IKEA couch and literally cried. I'd never imagined reaching this point back when I was standing alone on that front lawn at 17. Around the same time, Raphael offered me more stable work, complete with actual benefits, including health insurance, something I'd lacked since leaving home. His business was expanding, and he needed someone reliable. It was a huge vote of confidence, and it honestly meant more to me than any approval my parents had ever given me. Meanwhile, my parents kept attempting to reconnect, but always on their terms. They invited me to holiday dinners, only to criticize my choices throughout the meal. They'd offer their help, but always with strings attached. Every interaction left me emotionally drained and resentful, so eventually, I reduced contact to occasional texts and maybe one awkward visit per year. What they never seemed to grasp was that I'd actually built a pretty decent life. Sure, it wasn't anything like they'd planned, but it was good. I enjoyed my job, paid my bills comfortably, and had friends who accepted me exactly as I was. By age 23, I'd earned additional certifications and had become Raphael's trusted go-to person for specific types of projects. We worked incredibly well together, and he started mentioning bigger opportunities down the road. Around that same time, Haley entered my life. She needed some repairs at her apartment, and Raphael sent me over. Haley was smart, funny, and had zero tolerance for nonsense. We started dating, and for the first time, I let someone truly get to know me, all the baggage and family history included. Rather than running away, Haley understood completely. Her own family wasn't perfect either, though definitely not as controlling as mine. Of course, once my parents heard I was seriously dating someone, they suddenly became intensely interested in my life again. They started following me on Instagram after years of acting like I didn't exist. They wanted to meet Haley, pretending they were eager to play the happy family role again, but I kept them at arm's length. Haley deserved better than to get caught up in their manipulative games. For years after being kicked out, I was finally stable, had my own place, was in a healthy relationship, and had built a life entirely on my own terms. My parents' prediction, that I'd come crawling back begging within a month, had proven completely wrong. But my story wasn't over yet. Just when I thought I'd moved beyond their shadow, things started getting complicated in ways I never anticipated. I'll share part 3 tomorrow because there's a lot more to tell. Things start shifting for both me and my parents in unexpected ways. Update 2, hey everyone. Thanks so much for continuing to follow my story. Your support means more than I can express. To pick up where I left off, by the time I was 24, life had settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. I bounced between jobs, steadily building up experience and putting aside money whenever possible. Nothing glamorous, mostly grunt work, but it paid the bills and kept me moving forward. My apartment was a tiny studio with a kitchenette barely large enough for a mini fridge and microwave, but it was mine. No roommates, no parents, just me and my second-hand furniture. One night, I was scrolling through Facebook, yeah, the boomer app, I know, and got a notification. My cousin Brooke had tagged me in a photo from a family gathering I obviously didn't attend. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I saw my parents in the background. Mom wore a fake smile I'd seen too often, and Dad was mid-storytelling. But the strangest thing? On the table next to them was a framed picture of me from my high school graduation. Seriously? These were the same people who'd thrown me out, rarely contacted me unless they needed something, and now were displaying my photo as if we were a happy family. I immediately called Brooke, and she casually said, "Oh yeah, they talk about you all the time, constantly telling everyone how proud they are." The sheer audacity left me speechless. It was like they lived in a completely different reality where they'd never confidently declared I'd come crawling back in a month. Anyway, around this time I crossed paths with Haley. It wasn't anything out of a romantic movie. We were both stuck in line at Target, complaining about how painfully slow the self-checkout was. She had this brutally honest way of speaking, just blurting out whatever popped into her head without any filters. We swapped Instagram handles, started texting, and instantly clicked. By our third date, we found ourselves talking about family stuff, and I ended up sharing my own complicated history. I was bracing myself for that awkward, sympathetic nod you usually get, but instead, she opened up about her own experiences with a controlling stepdad. It wasn't as severe as my situation, but she understood exactly where I was coming from. That night we talked till almost 3 a.m., and for the first time, my messed up family situation didn't feel like some shameful secret I had to keep hidden. A few months into our relationship, my water heater dramatically broke down. I came home one day to find water spilling out from under my bathroom door, forcing me to shut off the main valve and endure freezing showers at the gym for 3 days while waiting for my landlord to fix it. Haley offered to let me stay with her, but honestly, it felt too soon. I'd developed this stubborn independence over the years, and it was tough to shake. Around the same time, I got an invite to my high school friend Spencer's wedding. I hadn't seen most of those people in years, and honestly, I was pretty nervous about what they'd think. Would they judge me as the guy who failed, who skipped college, who vanished without a trace? But when Haley and I arrived, everyone treated us normally. They asked what I'd been up to, showed genuine interest when I talked about my jobs, and didn't judge or compare me to some idealized version of who I was supposed to be. But then came a weird moment. Spencer's mom, who had kindly let me stay on their couch when I got kicked out, pulled me aside to tell me my parents had been asking about me. Apparently, they'd run into her at the grocery store and spent a solid 20 minutes trying to dig up details, where I was living, what I was doing, and if I was financially okay. That last part especially set off alarm bells in my head. Sure enough, a week later, my mom texted out of nowhere. "Dylan, your father and I are having a small Memorial Day gathering. It would be lovely if you could come. Bring your friend if you want." Friend, not girlfriend. Like she couldn't even acknowledge Haley's importance in my life. And the timing was suspicious, given their recent inquiries about my financial situation. When I showed Haley the text, she simply raised an eyebrow and said, "So they want something." Despite her skepticism, I decided to attend. Maybe out of curiosity or some lingering hope for closure. Haley came along for moral support, even though she joked that the situation had disaster written all over it. Walking into my parents' house was surreal. Everything was exactly the same furniture, the same family photos on the walls, now including my graduation picture, even the same overpowering apple cinnamon air freshener my mom always used, which gave me a headache every time. But despite the familiar setting, I felt like a stranger, not a son coming home. The small gathering consisted of my parents, my aunt and uncle, my dad's coworker Eli, and his wife. Everyone behaved normally, as if I was just some kid who'd been away at school for a while. The entire evening, I kept waiting for something to go wrong, and eventually, after dinner, it did. My dad took me into his study, a room I wasn't even allowed to enter as a kid without explicit permission. He started with awkward small talk about how tough the economy was, before finally getting to his point. He'd been downsized from his job after 27 years, replaced by a younger guy with a fancy degree who would work for less money. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of pushing college on me, now he resented college graduates. He didn't directly ask me for money but dropped plenty of hints about their current financial struggles, emphasizing how families should help each other through tough times. I sat there quietly, thinking about the night they threw me out, about my mom's confident smirk, her certainty that I'd be crawling back in a month. I told him I'd think it over, mostly because I didn't trust myself to speak without saying something I'd regret. Haley and I left shortly afterward. As soon as we got in the car, she turned to me and remarked dryly, "Well, that was officially the most passive-aggressive dinner I've ever survived." Over the next few weeks, the messages from my mom picked up again. She'd ask how I was doing, if I'd thought about what my dad said, or if I wanted their old dining table since they were updating the house, which I took to mean selling furniture to pay bills. Meanwhile, things were genuinely improving for me. I'd landed a decent job, not flashy, but steady and with actual benefits. Haley and I were growing closer, discussing moving in together to a bigger place since my tiny studio apartment was basically a closet, and her roommate was driving her crazy. Then came a Facebook post from my mom that changed everything. It was a long, dramatic statement about how hard things had been, and trusting God's plan during unemployment. Clearly, it was designed to fish for sympathy and support. The comments were filled with supportive messages from relatives and church friends, but what got me was the final paragraph. "We're so blessed to have our son Dylan supporting us through this trial. Family truly is everything." I nearly spit out my coffee reading it. I hadn't agreed to anything or given them a cent, yet here she was, publicly stating I was financially helping them. The comments praised me as a good son, and the pressure felt deliberate. Furious, I immediately called her and demanded an explanation. She acted shocked by my anger, claiming she was merely expressing gratitude for emotional support and that others jumped to conclusions. But I knew exactly what she was doing, creating public pressure to guilt me into helping financially. That night, Haley found me anxiously crunching numbers on a spreadsheet, trying to see if I could afford to help them without jeopardizing my own stability. She quietly sat down next to me, took my hand, and gently asked, "What would you tell a friend in your situation?" That question struck me deeply. If someone else told me their parents kicked them out at 17, barely contacted them afterward except when it suited them, and now demanded financial support, I'd tell them they didn't owe those people anything. And right then, I made my decision. I texted my mom clearly, letting her know I wouldn't be providing financial support. I acknowledged their struggles but reminded her that I was still rebuilding my life from being thrown out as a teenager. I even suggested local job resources and financial assistance programs, the very same ones I'd relied on years earlier. Her response? A simple, "Okay." After that, silence for 3 full weeks. That silence abruptly ended yesterday when my phone practically exploded with notifications, texts, calls, and voicemails, not just from my parents, but from numerous relatives as well. Apparently, my parents' financial situation had worsened significantly. My dad still hadn't found work, and now they were facing possible foreclosure. Somehow, they decided that their financial crisis was mine to fix. One particularly frustrating voicemail from my aunt told me it was time to step up and be the man your father raised you to be. I couldn't help but laugh bitterly at the irony of that statement. Haley and I stayed up late into the night discussing everything: family obligations, personal boundaries, the differences between forgiving and forgetting, and what I could realistically handle emotionally and financially. Honestly, I'm still not entirely sure what I'll do. Part of me genuinely wants to help because, despite everything, they're still my parents. Another part of me vividly recalls standing outside their house with my bags, hearing my mom confidently declare I'd never make it on my own. The roles had completely reversed in a way neither of us could have predicted 9 years ago. I decided to meet them tomorrow, alone, at a neutral location, a coffee shop, to keep emotions in check. I already have some clear conditions in mind if I choose to help, boundaries they won't be allowed to cross again. Life's strange like that. 9 years ago, they thought I couldn't survive a month without their support. Now, they're the ones struggling without me. Maybe that's karma, or maybe just the universe's twisted sense of humor. I'll update everyone after our meeting. Thanks again for all the support, seriously, it means a lot. Finally, here's an update. Yesterday, I left things hanging. Right before my big investor meeting, my mom called me in a panic. At first, I ignored her. I was way too busy prepping for my presentation and sorting out last-minute details. But then she called 4 more times in quick succession, followed by calls from my aunt and my cousin. Clearly, something serious was happening. Reluctantly, I answered, struggling to understand my mom through her frantic sobs. Eventually, she managed to explain that my dad had been laid off again, but this time things were even worse. They were 3 months behind on their mortgage, their car had just broken down, and they'd just received an eviction notice. They had 2 weeks to pay or lose everything. I sat in my office, staring at my wall lined with awards and certificates I'd earned, feeling numb. Actually, annoyed would be a better description. Annoyed that, after all these years, they were still pulling the same stunt, expecting me to drop everything and rescue them. And the timing couldn't have been worse, landing just before the most critical meeting of my career. I told her I'd call her back and hung up, then just sat there, trying to process everything. Haley immediately sensed something was wrong. After hearing me out, she didn't push me in any direction. Instead, she calmly asked how I wanted to handle things. That kind of support is exactly why I love her. I decided to tackle one crisis at a time, prioritizing my investor meeting and then dealing with my family situation afterward. I turned my phone off, buckled down, and pushed family drama aside to focus. The meeting went remarkably well, better than I'd dared hope. The investors were impressed with my work and vision, asking tough but fair questions that I'd prepared for. By the end, they were even talking about backing future projects. It was everything I'd worked towards since that rainy night 9 years ago when my parents kicked me out. When I finally switched my phone back on, I found 27 missed calls, not just from my parents, but from relatives, even some I barely knew. My voicemail was overflowing, and my Facebook Messenger was swamped. Apparently, my mom had rallied the entire extended family to pressure me into helping. Driving home, I felt a confusing mix of pride about the successful meeting, frustration about my family's tactics, and a nagging sense of obligation I couldn't quite shake. Walking into my apartment, Haley was already on the couch with her laptop, looking both concerned and incredulous. She showed me a new Facebook post from my mom, a long, emotional rant about losing their home and how certain family members, without naming me directly, had forgotten family comes first. The comments beneath the post were filled with pointed remarks. Dylan will surely help once he sees this, and family is everything, he'll come through. Reading those comments made my blood boil. My parents were openly trying to shame and manipulate me into helping them. At that moment, I'd had enough. I was done with vague boundaries, sporadic support, and strained holiday visits. It was time to either genuinely fix this relationship or end it altogether. I sent my parents a simple, direct text saying I'd meet them tomorrow at their house to settle this once and for all. Just me, them, and 9 years' worth of unresolved baggage. That night, I hardly slept at all, lying awake rehearsing conversations in my head, anticipating their responses. Haley held me close, reminding me that whatever happened, we had built a strong life together. She reassured me that no matter what unfolded with my parents, I already had a family, our friends, all the people who had genuinely stood by me. The next morning, I drove to their house feeling calmer than I expected. Their neighborhood hadn't changed much since my childhood, but their home had clearly deteriorated. The paint was peeling off the siding, the lawn was overgrown, and my mom's beloved flower beds were overrun with weeds. It was like witnessing the physical reflection of their declining situation. My dad answered the door. He'd aged noticeably over recent years, his hair grayer, his frame thinner, his shoulders permanently slouched as if weighed down by something invisible but heavy. Without a word, he simply nodded and stepped aside to let me in. Inside, things looked even worse, dusty surfaces, clutter everywhere, and the musty smell that takes over when regular upkeep is neglected. My mom was sitting at the kitchen table, her eyes swollen and red from crying. The moment she saw me, she immediately launched into her rehearsed relief speech, how thankful she was I'd come, certain I'd arrived to rescue them without even hearing me out first. I interrupted her, asking both of them to sit down and listen. For once, they would hear me out without interruption. I calmly laid out everything, the way they'd thrown me out for daring to envision a different future than the one they'd scripted, their smug certainty that I'd return begging for forgiveness within weeks, the years of reaching out only when they needed something, and their complete lack of genuine remorse or accountability. My dad tried to cut in, throwing out the usual justifications. They were just trying to guide me, I was disrespectful, they'd done their best raising me. I raised my hand firmly and continued speaking. I described the early days after they kicked me out, how I'd slept on couches, juggled multiple exhausting jobs, cried myself to sleep out of sheer loneliness and fatigue. I explained how I'd been forced to figure out basic adult responsibilities alone because they'd chosen to value their conditions and expectations over their child. My mom began sobbing again, admitting they'd made mistakes, but insisting family must stick together. That triggered something deep inside me, and I finally snapped. I asked where this sense of family unity was when I was a homeless teenager. I pointed out that their idea of family conveniently only surfaced when they needed something from me, never when I needed support. We went in circles for a while, them offering vague apologies immediately followed by excuses, turning blame back onto me. Classic manipulation tactics. Eventually, I grew exhausted with the runaround and clearly laid down my conditions. First, I'd help them avoid foreclosure just this once, after which they'd need to downsize to something genuinely affordable. Second, they would have to remove the manipulative Facebook post and publicly clarify they were managing their finances privately. Third, if they genuinely wanted any kind of relationship going forward, we'd all need to attend therapy, not necessarily to reconcile, but to establish healthy communication and clear boundaries. Finally, they had to respect my autonomy, my relationship, my life choices. Any future support, emotional or financial, hinged entirely on this respect. I expected resistance, emotional manipulation, or guilt trips, but instead, my dad appeared utterly defeated, as though he finally realized he'd run out of moves. My mom, however, was harder to read.